Welcome everyone to another discussion on strategic thinking. I have with me Joel Wenger, who I've known actually quite a long time. Has a great history of application in this topic and study behind it. So really looking forward to this conversation on strategy. So Joel, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So thanks, Jamie. Joel Wenger here. Variety of experience related to strategy, working from, all the way from the shop floor to working with the C-suite, and that includes suppliers, OEMs, consulting, even some entrepreneurial ventures. So I've been really fortunate to see strategy development at many different levels and in many different environments. My background is mechanical engineering, a bachelor's from Kettering University, and then an MBA from the Ross School of Business over in Ann Arbor, and that was focused on strategy. And currently, I'm working at the ZF Group on their ADAS product strategy.
That's fantastic. So while a different degree, we share the University of Michigan heritage. So that's super cool. And
good, yeah, go blue.
Go blue, go blue. So to start us off, this is one of my favorite questions because it really helps to frame how you think, in this case, about strategy. So do you view strategy as a process, a decision, or a way of thinking?
So I'd say of the three, I'd say it's a process most of the time. It's the way you move from your current state to your future state based on your specific situation, and of course with any process there are decisions that need to be made and there are ways of thinking you need to apply, but it's not static, right? So you may make a move and your competitor may make a move, and so it's not just one decision. And while thinking is an important part, there's also other aspects like planning. So there are elements of tactics and execution in there, how you're going to make the strategy happen. So it comes most of the time as a process, but there are decision and ways of thinking enrolled into that.
Yeah, that's very good. And so, seeing it as a process, right, you're able to attach other things along the way, elements that help feed that process, but that process provides the backbone upon how you think.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So within that process, as you mentioned, it's, getting from one point to another point. What do you see as the difference between the strategic thinking that happens and the strategic planning that happens?
So to me, the strategic thinking is really it's a divergent activity, right? You're considering what your options are. It's what's possible. This is where you do, a lot of the brainstorming, the design thinking, innovation workshops, things like that, where you're really trying to get out of your comfort zone, so to speak. You're trying to figure out what are the different things and possibilities for us. On the strategic planning side, that's really the convergent activity. So now that you have all the possibilities, now you're determining more along the lines of what's probable. So every organization has a limited amount of resources at their disposal, and those are going to shape how you actually go after those different possibilities. And those limits also help you figure out what you won't do, which in many cases can be just as important as what you decide to do.
Yeah, that's I think an important distinction, right? Especially in large organizations, although I think large organizations are simply more versed in understanding their limits than, say, startups are. But fundamentally, you can only do what you can do, right? You have so many levers, resources, and options available, and so understanding the risk and the options, getting to a plan is a pretty important point. Just going back to the divergent thinking of the strategic thinking, how much is that a skill, and a way of thought that is inherent to the individual, or can a good process help draw out divergent strategic thinking in anyone?
So I'd say to start, strategic thinking's for everybody, especially in today's business environment where you really need people at every level of your organization coming up with ways to do things better, cheaper, or faster. So you really want everyone thinking about what's possible. Um, at a very minimum, everyone at least needs to know or understand the strategic thinking that's behind the strategy. So it's only when you have everybody aligned can everyone operate autonomously, and you don't, I'd say their daily activities are aligned with where the organization's headed. You don't have to have micromanagement. In terms of eliciting that, I think that's where some of the classical or traditional business school frameworks can really be useful, because then you can kind of segment out what it is, what information you're trying to get, and then you can go and interview different people within the organization or externally to try to piece together the divergent aspects, or the different things you can go after.
No, that's good. And I like the fundamental aspiration of really looking at it as for everyone. Clearly a better understanding of the strategy and the strategic thinking behind it helps enable, as you said, less micromanagement, which I think appeals to an awful lot of people.
Yes.
How do we get less micromanagement and better understanding of the strategic thinking helps that. As being a capability that, as you said, is for everyone. Is that easy then to develop throughout an organization at every level? Is it simply emerge from being part of the process, or do you explicitly go develop that strategic thinking at every level of the organization?
So I think, so I'd say right now, especially with the younger workforce coming in, I think they want that, not freedom, but they want that interaction. They want to be part of that discussion. So I think there's a drive from their end to do it. And I think from an organizational perspective, that's a way to drive engagement with your workforce. So I think a lot of people are heading that way. But I'd say you need to be able to provide some guidance. So, not everybody has gone to B school and done the frameworks. There's tons of information out there on the framework, so anybody can pick it up and start doing it. But you really need to help guide them, because in a lot of cases, as you go up the chain of management and executives, you have access to more information. You have a better understanding of the company's current position. So it's kind of, you have the drive from the employees, and I think a lot of them appreciate being involved. But I think on the other side, you need to have some mentoring and some coaching from the executives to really give them an idea of what's important for our strategy, for this business, and why that is, so that they can have that understanding.
Yeah, that's good, and I think that coaching aspect is pretty important when we start thinking about the role of senior leaders in that strategic thinking. In your experience, how much is the coaching of strategic thinking, the coaching on the strategy itself, maybe at one end of the spectrum versus simply deployment and communication of the strategy at the other end? How much of that is a deliberate thought process about how do we engage the organization, or is the overriding culture of an organization really the determining factor on how engaged and how they approach that broader audience?
I'd say your second point. The overriding factor is the culture. In organizations that are more open, or let's say that they're more trusting, or there's an environment of trust, there usually is a lot more discussion. In organizations that have more of a top-down approach, it's more, here's the strategy, make it happen. And so one of the things that I've encountered is that a lot of managers feel that the strategic thinking piece is their job. It's, they've kind of earned that right as they've progressed to the ranks, so they protect it. And so that's where you start to see some of the political battles and power in the organization come about. And it's unfortunate, because I think in a lot of cases, you really benefit from a diversity of thought and a diversity of experience on that strategic thinking side, because you're trying to make it, like I said, divergent. You want a lot of different ideas. You want to figure out what's possible. And if you limit the number of people, you're also limiting that to just their viewpoints. And I think when you engage the organization, you get a lot broader solution set, so to speak, that you can use. That doesn't mean you'll use everything, but it does help you maybe get around your personal blind spots, I'll call them.
Right. No, I think that's an important part about the strategic thinking. Seeing the bigger picture. We like to talk about off the chessboard, right? Not just the obvious moves in front of you, but beyond. See even why you're playing the game, and so yeah, blind spots and being able to be aware of and then pick apart your own blind spots becomes part of that strategic thinking.
Yes.
I want to ask you next about really limitations on shaping the strategy, but as a stepping stone to that, since you brought this up, is how much can you separate the political positions in an organization from the strategy development? Obviously, it's beneficial when you can, but is that just something you've got to be aware of, or can you really sort of pull those two apart?
So I'd say you can't pull them apart. And it kind of in my experience in doing consulting, that was one of the most difficult parts. You as an outsider coming in, you have a 30,000-foot view. You don't have the politics involved, so you can be very rational about the strategy you're providing. But at the same time, you're not living the day-to-day activity that's going on. You're not the manager that's getting a lot of pressure from his direct boss to do things a certain way or to execute a certain way, and you can't replicate that as a consultant. So I think that's one of the difficulties there. You can have a strategy that separates it out, but you start to get into an area where you're not really dealing with reality, because as you talk about any kind of strategy, it's you're basically talking about changing the organization, and the greater the change that you try to implement, the greater the resistance. And we talk about organizational pain, and so unless your current state is more painful than the change that you're trying to bring about, it's a valid factor you're going to have to overcome. And really, that's one of the key challenges for anybody working in any organization on any strategy, is overcoming that internal resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my observations around maybe very discrete examples of the politics in strategy is when a company acquires a startup and the founder comes along with it, right? And it's all about, does the founder's vision and strategy win, or does the parent company influence that? And it leads to fundamentally a lot of decisions about whether that founder stays or goes.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And a lot of times the skills that you bring as a founder, as you start to scale, maybe aren't the same skills that you need to bring it to the next level. And that's also a difficult conversation to have with a founder, because it's their baby.
Right. Absolutely. Their baby and their strategy. At least.
Right. Exactly. Their strategy.
So along with the politics, what other factors of the current strategy, right? The organization, the skills, the assets, how does the current setting, the current state of the organization act as an anchor in setting the new strategy? How much and how do those weigh in?
So this is a great question. I love this question. And the reason I love it is because it is one of the biggest challenges you face when crafting any strategy, the interplay between where you currently are, your current state, and that future state. And so, first, a lot of people talk about, should it even impact it? And to me, there's no should about it. It does, period. The next question is, how much? And that's where I'm going to give you a traditional business school answer, consulting answer. It depends. It depends which part you're talking about. So going back to what we talked about before, the difference between thinking and planning, in the strategic thinking piece, it doesn't come into play at all. It shouldn't even be on the table. That's a brainstorming. That's a free thinking. Shouldn't limit you at all. Where it becomes an anchor or an important piece is during the planning phase, because it serves as your baseline. It is your starting point for everything. And, I use an example, if you and I were to do some strategic thinking on our own and we both arrive on the fact that we want to go after the same job, let's say, our strategic plans for going and attaining that job would be different because you and I have different starting points. Mm-hmm. So our current state would dictate what actions we take. You could say our strengths and weaknesses would be different. So how we sold ourselves, how we went about preparing would be different. So that strategic plan would be very different, even though the end goal would be the same. And so that's, to me, one of the key things why the starting point matters so much. And you could apply that, that was a personal example, but you could say, two companies that end up going after the same target customer could be Harley-Davidson, Kawasaki, could be Buick decides to take on Tesla. Their strengths and weaknesses are different and their starting points are different. So their strategic plan would be different, even though that end result, they're going after the same thing. And it kind of ties into what we were just talking about. Depending on what you're going after, that starting point dictates just how much change your organization is going to need to experience. And as we just talked about, that's one of the most difficult things to do. So being hyper realistic about that starting point is critical, because that really lays the foundation for the actions you're going to take and whether or not you successfully identify all the actions you will need to take to reach your goal.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important part of thinking about strategy is the pathway to get to where you want to go. And I certainly work with plenty of organizations that feel that the strategy is simply the destination, and then you let everybody else figure out how to get there. And certainly, I think in both of our views of strategy, it's not just the destination, but the pathway. And in those cases, then the current state matters a great deal.
Exactly. And a lot of times, I'd say, your strategy typically needs to be flexible because no one can predict the future. If you're talking 7 years out or your long-term strategy, this is our target, you might have to adjust or pivot along the way because your competition reacts to you or some new technology development pops up. So having that end goal is great, but as we're talking right now, that pathway is going to, that's really how you're going to be able to achieve it or not. And that's going to determine your success.
Right. Yep. And somebody with a bigger gap or a different pathway to get to that gap, you need to understand what you're dealing with from a framework before you chart your course. So
exactly. That's one of the reasons I was adamant about not saying should we or shouldn't we, because as soon as you say, well, should we or shouldn't we, you're not dealing with reality anymore. You've kind of created this ideal state. And so you've created another interim, I'd say, milestone in your path, going from current to ideal and then ideal to future. And usually, as you mentioned, people just assume that you can skip that gap and go to ideal and then future, and you've kind of set yourself up to fail because you haven't addressed probably some very painful issues, which is the reason you're not at your ideal state.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there will be a lot of insight gained there.
Right.
So you talked about this earlier, so I think I know the general direction of your answer about involving people. And part of your answers earlier are also about what current generations want out of their organization around that sense of involvement. But how many people can you really involve in crafting the strategy? And I think that also implies sort of a how is consensus versus versus input and then a decision maker. Is that have a play as well in how many cooks we have in the kitchen?
So that's another good point. I think that's one of the challenges is how do you get the right number of people involved in the right part of the process? When it comes to strategic thinking, I think most organizations don't have enough people involved. So we kind of talked about it earlier. People kind of feel like they own that part of it. And what ends up, what I've seen happen before is that then they craft the strategy with too few people. And then in order to get organizational support and buy-in, way too many people are involved in the planning. And what ends up happening is the focus gets watered down because then you have a lot of people coming in, well, we can't not do that, or we have to do this, or this has to be taken care of. And so you kind of water down the strategy in order to get everybody's approval. And I kind of look at it and say it's not so much too many cooks, it's there's too many head chefs and not enough cooks in a lot of places. So for me, when I think about strategic thinking, I always try to involve as many people as possible. You know, we talked a little bit about using the frameworks as a way to involve more people, and there's frameworks for every part of every function of an organization. So depending on who you're going after, you can structure the data that way and kind of collect inputs. That doesn't mean everyone gets an equal say in planning, though. And so you need to make known up front that, okay, I'm involving you in the process, but the ultimate decision lays with this person, whether it's you, whether it's your boss, however you're looking at it. And that's really where the strategic planning comes in. My experience has been, you really try to limit the number of people there to those that will either be responsible for results or directly impacted by the implementation. And the reason being is that those are the people that you need to be engaged, and those are the people that you need to own it. Because otherwise, you can have the greatest strategy in the world, but then it's going to fall on its face during execution. And so if you can get the people that are going to execute and be responsible to help you craft the plan, it has a much greater chance of success. It's not always possible, and that can be really difficult politically speaking, but that's the starting point I look at. If you're going to anchor somewhere, anchor to that and try to work your way back rather than trying to just cover all your bases and invite everybody to the process.
Yeah, I really like that phrase. You know, it's not how many cooks, it's how many head chefs. I think that, and that, you know, what you described really talks to the clear roles in the process, right? It's not about whether you're involved or not. It's what your role is in it, and having that clearly defined manages both expectations, but also ensures that the right decisions are made in the right place, especially where people who have to be accountable for delivering on it have a pretty big say in it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So you've led this, you know, coming as a consultant is certainly one place where this is I don't want to say challenging, but really important. But getting the right inputs to craft a strategy, you know, knowns, unknowns, big questions, et cetera. How do you ensure you get the right amount of inputs without being overwhelmed and not being, as we talked about earlier, not being overwhelmed with blind spots?
Mm-hmm. So we've touched on it a couple of times. It's the frameworks are again a great way to nail them down and organize the data. They're not going to make a decision for you, but in terms of, you know, collecting data and being able to catalog it and organize it, they're great for that. And it's also a great way to, you know, as we talked about, engage more of the organization, because they are, you know, you can customize them for areas of expertise, whether it's marketing or operations. But it doesn't have to be limited to internal. And this kind of gets to the blind spot. You know, if you just say interview people inside, you get an inside view. And one of the great things that, or great techniques that I learned was that so for instance, let's say you're doing a SWOT analysis, go to your customer and ask them what they think your strengths and weaknesses are, because many times it's not what your internal folks are going to tell you. And it's just another great way to kind of go after the blind spots, because now you're getting an external view. And it doesn't have to be your customers, it could be trusted advisor, but get an outside perspective of somebody who maybe isn't involved in the day-to-day and can just look at it from a 30,000 foot view and say, well, you know, this is what I always thought. It could be wrong. Maybe they need to be educated on the subject, but it gives you the reality of what's going on. I also really like to use scenario planning in order to think about the impacts, because a lot of times you don't know what you don't know, and you won't know it until it happens. And so you can use scenario planning to say, well, what if these things happen? Does it have an impact on my business? And it's kind of like a design FMEA approach, but for strategy, because you can look at it and say, if this were to happen and it has no impact on my business, the unknowns around it, what's going on, probably doesn't need to be addressed in my strategic plan. If we look at a scenario plan and say, if this scenario were to play out for whatever reason, whatever unknowns cause it, black swan, whatever, and there is a huge impact to my business, then this is something you're going to want to include in your strategic plan, even if it's just something as simple as monitoring some kind of warning sign key measurement. I mean, maybe you're monitoring your quotes and suddenly what the customer's asking for is slightly different. Okay, well, that could be a sign that something's happening in the industry. You need to investigate. Or it could be, maybe it's well enough known that you could put together a mitigation plan. You actually go through and say, well, if this were to happen, we'd shift these resources here, or we change our technology to this, or we alter our sourcing strategy. A great example would be, the supply chain disruptions that we have, that we've had over the past few years. That caused a lot of people to go back through and evaluate, hey, if a natural disaster does occur and we can't get our parts, what are we going to do? How are we going to keep our plants running? And, that's something that scenario planning can at least help you in the start to identify, okay, do we need to worry about this? And if we do, now let's try to figure out what those unknowns are. And if we can't figure them out, what measurements could tell us something's wrong?
Mm-hmm. So scenario planning is an interesting one because it's as a part of the process, it forces people to think about the dynamic world that their strategy evolves through. Not everybody always wants to give it the time that it deserves, but as you mentioned, supply chain disruptions, right, between the pandemic and preceding but overlapping it, the U.S.-China trade wars and tariffs and everything else. These would traditionally be considered low risk, obviously high impact, but low risk type of scenarios, and generally get underwhelming support to put a lot of energy into those types versus the low risk but higher probability ones. So how do you manage that balance in the scenario planning process?
That to me goes back to that strategic planning aspect of who you involve. So you're right, as an organizational perspective, you're not going to get a lot of focus or attention to a low risk event. But the people that own the supply chain and have to deal with it every day probably have a slightly different perspective because that's their bread and butter. That's what they have to work on. And if that were to happen, they would be severely impacted or have been severely impacted. So it's not to say that they have free time, but I would say those are the people that I would want to involve early and often to get their opinions so that when we do formulate some kind of scenario plan, it really meets their needs. Because in the end, you can put it on a bookshelf, but you've addressed it with the right folks. So it touches on the right things. And more than likely, if you're responsible for that strategy, it is going to require you to do a bit more legwork. You're not going to get a lot of support, but if you get the right people involved, they'll make time because it's important to them. It's closer to their heart. It impacts their metrics, their bonus, whatever. And it's kind of the personal aspect of it. It will impact their performance.
That's good advice. Thanks for that. So one last question for you. You're clearly very passionate about this and certainly have a lot of experience at it. What do you most enjoy about the strategic process?
Honestly, it's the discussions you have, just like this that we're having right now. It's fun because I tend to like to do the divergent thinking and then do convergent thinking and say, well, what if this? Well, what about that? And then what about this? And what about that? And just the mulling over of ideas, talking about different topics, getting different perspectives, and then kind of drilling down and saying, well, why do you think that? And it's always a learning experience anytime you bring somebody new in. So we kind of touched on, the diversity aspect. You can get a lot of really great ideas, really different opinions that never came up. And it's like, that connects on these different levels, or I can now see why if you do X over here, it affects B way down here. And it's just fun discovering that. It's like a giant puzzle and figuring it out. It's very interesting.
That's great. I enjoy that part of it too. So really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I'm sure our listeners will learn a lot from it. And thank you for joining us.
Happy to do it, Jamie. Thank you for having me. It was a privilege, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff with you.
Great. Thanks.